Hello, everybody. My name is Josh. I am a policy analyst and one of the trainers with the Praed Foundation. I actually work for the University of Kentucky's Center for Innovation and Population Health, and we work in close proximity with the Praed Foundation. The Praed Foundation being sort of the keepers of the cans. And the folks who are able to distribute and support use of the cans and other TCOM tools around the country and in fact around the world. We have usage of the cans and some of the other tools in about a half a dozen countries besides the United States all around the world. So I'm real happy to be with you here today. I am actually a former employee of Barry's employer, and she'll be introducing herself in a few minutes, at Hillside Children's Center. And in my time there, before I moved over here to the Praed Foundation, I did a lot of work in community-based services. Spent a lot of time in families' living rooms and supporting kids in the community and their families in the community. And so our topic today, which is really talking about delivering the cans New York remotely, I kind of wanted to put that part of my history on full display, because I think it's going to be real important for all of us as we sort of think about how we are supporting use of this tool and really supporting care management in general in this sort of hopefully temporary new world, right, of working in this COVID-19 world. Barry and I kind of want to bring to you a little bit of our experiences and a little bit of our knowledge of what this type of work looks like. I also have some experience teaching in the classroom. I was a special education teacher for 8 years at the start of my career, and so come with some of that knowledge as well. I'll let Barry introduce herself now. She's going to be my co-trainer today.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Barry. I work for Hillside in Rochester, and I am currently the Western New York regional lead for the CANS New York Technical Assistance Institute. And so what that means is that Hillside is one of 4 partner agencies that partnered with New York State Department of Health. And we also partner with the Praed Foundation, which is now at University of Kentucky, where Josh is, to be able to provide assistance and support with everything in use of the cans for care managers of health homes serving children throughout New York State. And that may mean, excuse me, providing these new live virtual trainings or helping with certification process, even your TCOM training account. But also we want to follow through with you through your journey, just like you do with your families. And so anytime you may need assistance in case review or looking at using the tool in your practice, we are also just an email or phone call away. And hopefully if you don't know myself or one of the other regional leads yet, that you will soon know that you can reach out to us and that we are here for you with very minimal efforts. We'd love to connect. So my background is also in education for many years. I was an elementary education teacher in public schools in Boston and then also in the Rochester area. And then I transitioned to early childhood work. I did administration with OCFS Childcare Center and owned my own child development center as well. And I've done a lot of work with parenting and also with working with children with a variety of disabilities, special neurotypical development and atypical development in autism spectrum disorder and ADD. And I apologize, I did put a cough drop in my mouth. I thought I'd be finished with it before we started, but it's lingering. So I apologize for the little tickle today, but I'm happy to be here with you and have had the opportunity over the last 3 months to do a lot of virtual work with folks just like we're doing today. And so I've come to really appreciate not only the challenges of us working from home, but also the challenges in trying to connect human to human in a variety of different depths and levels. And so we've received lots of questions from folks that are questions that have brought us to the point where we are presenting this opportunity to discuss today. So hopefully we can share a little bit of what we've learned from folks just like you who are out there and have been trying to work the best they can with youth and families virtually in this new way. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. And so this is a part of our what we're calling our Lunch and Learn webinar series. So I referred to Barry as a co-trainer earlier, and I really should have said co-facilitator because we're not looking at this as a training so much as a facilitated conversation. And we really want this to be as much about you and your questions as it is about us and the content that we have. Some of you may know, and if you don't, we're going to give you a link at the end of this hour. We actually did a longer, kind of more formal kind of training webinar on this exact topic back in May as the pandemic was kind of ramping up. And so for this version that we're doing today, what we decided to do was, instead of just kind of reteaching that, we wanted to take some of the elements and in fact some of the slides that we liked a lot and that got good feedback in the first presentation and kind of talk a bit about them again, but then really make this more of a Q&A. And one of the reasons for that is, and I said we'll give you the link at the end, we did record that session back in May, and that is available to be viewed, and we think there's a lot of good stuff in there, so you're welcome to kind of continue your learning and your knowledge in this particular area by viewing that as well. You might have noticed already that this session is being recorded, and we plan to do the same thing with all of our Lunch and Learn webinars, where we are going to record them and put them on to our website for viewing. If you're nervous about having your face recorded for all time, what I can tell you is if you've never viewed a Zoom recording, it doesn't record. I have you in gallery mode so I can see all of you. It doesn't record the gallery mode. It actually just records the slides that are being presented. And then there's a small box up in the top corner for whomever is the active speaker. So at the moment, that would be me. So primarily it's going to be Barry and I will be the only faces seen. So don't worry if if you don't want to have a picture of yourself sipping coffee listed on our website for all time, you're not going to have that. So with that, we're going to kind of jump in. We want to talk a little bit today about really what it is, what are some of the skills and some of the strategies that we can think about implementing for doing what is really hard work, right? Developing a shared understanding of a child and family's needs, developing a collaborative assessment. And we want to talk a bit about how does that process work in the world, the online world, over Zoom, over WebEx, possibly just over the phone. Many of you are going to be doing this work in different ways based on the technology available to you and to your agency and how they're able to support you in doing that work. So with that, we do just want to get a little sense for who you folks are. So if you wouldn't mind just using the chat box right now and just let us know your name and what your role is relative to this work. And you can share the agency you work with as well. So your name, your role, and the agency that you're with, you can pop those into the chat box, and that will help us as we kind of answer your questions moving forward to have a sense of where you're coming from with that question and what the context is for how you are seeing this work. So thank you for those that have already jumped in. I'm seeing care managers, which is what we were expecting. Jessica, director at Gateway Longview, very cool. I'm not going to reread all of these, but Barry and I will take a look at those as we are going through. So a few things that we just really want to focus on today. We're going to be talking quite a bit about how do we effectively interact and try to engage children and youth and caregivers in this kind of COVID-19 world as we do this work online and via the phone. We're going to talk a bit about what are some of the barriers to that, specifically the barriers to effective engagement when we are using these technologies to do our work. We'll be talking a bit as well about how do we make this remote collaboration work? What are some of the strategies and some of the tips that we have for you? And ultimately, we want you folks to be able to share some of that as well. So with that, are there any questions anyone has kind of right here off the top before we dive into some of this? At any time, feel free to chat those questions in. Barry and I are both going to be monitoring that. And as I said, this is a lot more about you and your questions than it is about us and the content that we've brought to the table. So we really want to make sure that we're focused on you. So the first piece that I just want to share is a little bit of level setting for all of us. I suspect some of you, and based on some of your faces and names, I think some of you are probably very new to the CANS New York or new to care management and this type of work. I think some of you are probably more veteran at this and have been doing this work for a long time and maybe have a better sense of the tools and the supports that are available. But the one thing that we really like to put right out front off the top is this idea of what the CANS is and what the CANS isn't. And I always like to start with the isn't. I like to remind folks, and I do this a lot in pretty much every training I deliver, the CANS New York is not a questionnaire. right? And as you look through the materials that are available to you, the reference guide or the manual, as we like to call it, right? And in fact, all of the trainings that we offer for the CANS New York, both the ones online that help you get certified, as well as the live trainings that Barry and I and the other trainers on our team deliver, we never really talk about this is how you ask this question, or this is how you find out information about X, Y, or Z. And there's a very important reason for that, right? It's the idea that the CANS itself is really not an assessment. The CANS is actually an organizational tool and a decision-making tool. It is designed to gather the information from all the assessments that you do, help you organize that information into a way that can easily support you and other professionals to make good, smart decisions about the care that you're going to be providing for kids and for families. And so the ways in which you gather that information is going to be a collaboration between you, your colleagues, and the families that you serve, right? The assessments are going to be done based on the needs of all those people involved. It's so that you can start with yourself, right? Your own talent, your own skills, your own ability to develop engagement is going to be an important part of that. The ways in which you tend to ask questions best is going to be a big part of how you decide to gather information. Just as important, if not more so, is the ways in which kids and families want to be asked those questions and want to share their story with us, right? And then the third piece that is also important is how we gather that information from all those supporting pieces all around our kids and families. So how do we talk to their neighbors, their soccer coaches, their teachers and teachers' aides, the social workers that support them, the former workers in different programs they used to belong to, the current clinicians they work with, the pediatricians, right? All those people who know a little something about the kids and families we serve. It's our job as care managers to go out and find those bits of information to help better tell the story. So the CANS New York is really the storytelling tool, right? It doesn't tell us how to ask the questions. It just gives us an idea for how to organize that information that we gather from those questions. So that's an important piece for this as we think about this going through, that the ways in which you ask those questions is going to be unique to every one of you and every one of the kids and families that you serve. So what are a few things that we want to think about then as we're thinking about how do I meet with, and for the sake of making this a little easier on all of us, let's imagine that we're meeting with a brand new client to us, right? They've just joined our, either become affiliated with our agency, or they're brand new potentially to care management altogether. And we are really the first person that's getting to know them out of the box. What are some of the things that we want to consider as we get ready for those first few meetings that we're going to have in this virtual space with the kids and families that we serve, right? The first one right off the top is going to be the access to the technology and to the internet, right? And so it can feel simple, but it's important for us to be thinking about and talking about, right? Do the kids and families that we serve actually have access to the technology necessary to support an online or a virtual meeting, right? You folks all have access right now to Zoom in one way or another. Some of you had it loaded right onto your devices by your IT department. Others might have had to go and actually do some of the legwork with your IT department to get it installed. Some of you might have installed it yourself. I'll bet at least one of you out there is using a personal computer that it wasn't even provided by your employer because it works better for you and you can install that stuff yourself, right? The kids and families we serve don't have access to most of those resources. They don't have an IT department, right? They don't have a device that's provided to them and is sort of meeting a basic level of technological capability in order to support that. And so it becomes our job, really from that initial phone call when we sort of first introduce ourselves to a child or to their caregivers and say, hi, I'm Josh, I'm gonna be starting to work with you and I'd love to meet you. Here's our COVID-19 protocols. And so we'd like this first meeting to be virtual, right? From that point forward, one of the earliest pieces that we have to talk about is what is the technology available to you? And one of our pieces that we really want to encourage you to consider, obviously you're going to have to act within the protocols of your own agency, but we want you to really consider finding ways whenever possible to meet our clients and support the kids and families with where they're at technologically. So if we're supporting a family that is really comfortable on Zoom, great. That's what my employer uses. Most of my meetings are on Zoom. I'm really good with that. And I think we can work well together. But if they're more comfortable with a different product, right? Maybe they've used like the WebEx because one of the parents maybe is using that meeting platform for their own work. Or maybe they like FaceTime or some of the other products. We're going to do our best to address and try to meet with them on the technological grounds that we think can support, that they will feel most comfortable with, right? Again, considering again what your own protocols are with your agency. So if FaceTime is not a permitted tool because you either don't have Apple products or because the agency says no, certainly you're going to act within your protocols. But whenever possible, we're going to try to meet kids and families with where they're at on the technological kind of playground that they are most comfortable in and they know that their own devices work within, right? So we're going to talk with them about, do they have technology that can support it? Do they have Wi-Fi or 4G or whatever sort of means by which they're accessing the internet? Do they have availability for that? If they don't have any of that, what is their phone capability? Do they have minute limits, right? We're going to ask some of those questions early on so that we can really understand the ground rules for our conversations with kids and families and determine a way in which we can support them without causing problems for them. Right? We also want to recognize, and Barry and I have become experts at this because we do a lot of these online trainings. We're going to support the fact that many people out there in the world are not experts at Zoom or any other product, right? We've all probably gotten a little bit better at it than we were a year ago, but that doesn't mean that most of us are experts. And so we want to assess for that early on in those initial calls. What is your level of comfort, right? I'm going to ask the child. Many children in sort of 2020 world are going to be pretty comfortable with the technology depending on their age, but we're also going to assess caregivers for this, right? I want you to be honest with me. How comfortable are you with Zoom meetings, right? Both technologically and just socially comfortable. How does that feel to you? Where are you at with that? Does that feel comfortable to you, or would you prefer a phone call instead, right? We're going to make some of those assessments to determine level of skill and level of comfort for the folks that we serve. And we're doing this from our earliest calls with them, right? Which serves a few purposes. One, it shows them that we really care and we're trying to create an environment as best we can within the restrictions that we have. We're trying to create an environment that's going to support healthy work and healthy development and goal setting with our kids and families, right? But we're also making clear right from the start and trying to bring down as many of the barriers as we can so that we're not dealing with those barriers later on when we start running up against deadlines, when we start really trying to put in place plans of care, connect our kids to the services that they need. So we're doing that work from that earliest phase. Any questions on this before we jump to the next slide? And even if you don't have questions, but you just have thoughts, if you just have suggestions, if you've done some of this work and have a good idea for how to ask those questions, that's absolutely the kind of stuff that we're looking for from you folks. A few other essentials that we really want to consider once we push past the technology aspect of it is, what are the social and mental health aspects of what we're doing with kids and families? Or putting it another way, how are we assessing for safety? We talk about this a lot, and we actually have a 3-hour training on building engagement, right, with kids and families that we offer. We talk about this quite a bit in that training, this idea of assessing for safety and identifying the fact that some of those immediate safety concerns are so much more important really than even the assessment or even the plan of care that we're developing. Because if we don't address and think about the safety of the kids and families that we serve right from the top, they are not going to be in a place where they're really able to partner with us and work successfully with us. And so when we talk about safety, certainly we're talking about physical safety, but we're also talking about, when we talk about this digital safety, we're talking about, do they feel safe to really talk to us and really feel comfortable having a conversation with us about some of the challenges in their lives? So privacy becomes a critical component, something that when I meet with a child physically in the same space, right? Either in their living room, or maybe I pick them up from school and take them to the playground, I can make adjustments on the fly based on the amount of privacy that we have, right? So when I meet with that kid in their living room and their younger brother is running around and trying to impress us by doing some jumping jacks and whatever, I can adjust the way in which I ask questions to make sure that I'm not asking questions about real sensitive topics, right? And not trying to encourage my client or their caregiver to give me information that they might not feel comfortable giving me in front of that 6 or 7-year-old brother who just jumped into the room, right? I can do the same thing on the playground where I'm having maybe a conversation with a kid, and then as some other kids kind of come over to play some basketball, I can rearrange the ways in which I interact with that child based on the level of privacy available to me. In the digital space, it's a lot harder to do that, and so we have to be proactive about that, right? I can only see, I'm going to use Rhonda as an example, I can only see a blue wall in the bottom third of what I'm sure is a beautiful piece of art hanging on her her wall. And that's all that I know about Rhonda's scenario, right? There could be 15 people in the room with Rhonda, and I have no idea because that's not what I'm able to see right now. And so if I'm having a conversation with Rhonda and I'm starting to prepare her and say, there's going to be a few sensitive questions that I want to ask you and that I want to make sure that you feel safe talking about with me. And one of the first things I'm going to do is ask, is there anybody within earshot right now? Can people hear what I'm saying? Can people hear what you're saying? Right? And then if the answer is yes, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about how that can work, right? And part of it might be that it can't work in this current scenario. So we might talk about ways in which Rhonda can find a safer space within her home, right? And those conversations might look different if she's the parent versus if she's the child, right? And we're going to talk about the different places that she can go in her home to feel more safe. We're also going to potentially come up with maybe a safety phrase that she or I can share if things become less private than we intended them to be, right? So I might choose peanut butter sandwich, right? And if either of us work the word peanut butter, work the phrase peanut butter sandwich into what we're saying, that's our clue to each other that we're not private right now. Right. So if Rhonda's mom walks into the room and she doesn't want to be talking about this stuff in front of her mom, she's going to just be like, man, I'm really hungry for a peanut butter sandwich right now. And that's the clue to me that I'm not going to ask any of those sensitive questions to her right now. We're going to go back to a more superficial conversation, ask her about the weather, whatever that is, right, until she feels safe with me, and vice versa, because part of privacy happens on our side of the Zoom call. Right. I know, we heard some noise earlier that I assumed was probably some kids who are home doing some remote learning right now. Right. And so I'm going to recognize that that's probably the case for a lot of us as working professionals, myself included. My kids are not here right now, but another day of this week, they will be. And so I have to be mindful that I may sometimes have to send that message. I can't be private right now. Right. And I might also have to make some choices about where I'm going to be holding this meeting and the place that I'm going to be, and make sure that the babysitting is appropriate for my kids so that I can be giving my all and giving my private time to kids and families. And then we're also going to be mindful of how the technology can support that, right? Putting earbuds in helps me to keep at least your side of the conversation private, though somebody in my house might still hear me speaking, right? But I can at least make a half of a conversation private by putting in some earbuds or keeping better control over the volume. And there's a lot of different approaches that can be taken for that. We might also need to be mindful of what assistive technology pieces might be necessary for the kids and families that we serve, right? In the same way that we would do this type of work for in-person work, assessing if any assistive technology or translation services or interpretation services are necessary, we would look to do that same work even in an online space. When necessary, involve a translator. When necessary, potentially do more of our communication through the chat box than through the auditory space, based on the needs of the folks that we're serving. But ultimately what we're getting at here is we have to do this planning ahead of time, right? We need to gather this information and understand our situations and what these situations look like on both sides of the Zoom window, and do that work in the very early stages of our relationship building with kids and families, so that when it comes time to actually ask some of those tough questions and explore some of those difficult topics, we've done everything we can to try to limit those barriers to good, effective work for when that time comes. I've been talking a lot. What do people think about this so far? And Barry, if you've got stuff to add, you should definitely jump in too.
I just had a question, if you could speak to this sort of in-between access that folks have where they may not have access to Zoom or computer. They do have an iPhone. And is it possible to use something like FaceTime or something that's more streamlined for a lot of folks who have a smartphone?
I'm going to turn that question around to the rest of you, because my initial thought, Barry, is yes, it is certainly possible, but I know a lot of you have rules that your own employers apply to those situations. And so if you kind of know what your rules are around using some of those products, or if your agency has said, we are going to use GoToMeeting and nothing else or something like that, that's kind of good information to even just share to the chat box right now, because it helps us all kind of understand what's going on out there for the kids and families that we serve, especially since a lot of the kids we serve are served by multiple agencies. So you may have some colleagues here in the Zoom who are working for another agency, but one that might still interface with the same families you do. And so that can be really helpful information for all of us to know. So Allison was mentioning that she's limited to Microsoft Teams and Zoom for confidentiality reasons. So your agency has chosen sort of those products to be the ones that sort of exist behind your confidentiality firewall. Denise talked about you were initially told that any devices were fine, but now Microsoft Teams. For those that don't know, Microsoft Teams is kind of an organizational tool that Microsoft puts out, and it has a bunch of different features. You can do like text chats. You can actually store your files within it, so people like on your team can all share files, but also it has a Zoom-like video chat product as a part of it, just like what we're on with Zoom. That they have one through Teams. I forget exactly what it's called. Christina says her staff does use FaceTime, that it's approved for the agency. They find that children like that a lot are familiar with it. So that's a really good point. Certainly not every kid has an iPhone, but quite a few do. And so that's the Apple native face chatting product, which can be easy to use. You know, Apple, you can say what you want about Apple, but they make their products easy to use. That's one of their hallmarks, right? But also keeping in mind that privacy has been really important. Finding that sometimes the children don't even identify it at first, but then when we're able to see them safely outside or even in the driveway on the porch, they acknowledge more than they did inside the house. So that's a really great point, right? That that sometimes our kids are not realizing how private they might be until they are sort of able to be with us in a somewhat more normal setting and sort of acknowledge it. Yeah, you know, there's some stuff I didn't tell you when we were on the FaceTime, you know, and it's probably because, you know, my sister's in the bedroom just next door and the walls are thin and she can hear everything I say and I don't want her to hear that. So that's a really great point that we have to kind of continue to be doing that assessing. Does anyone use WhatsApp? Simone asks. I've used it for my own personal purposes. I've never used it for meeting with a child or family. But that certainly is a product that I think, does WhatsApp have a video chat feature? I honestly don't remember. So Simone, you can let us know it does. Okay. One of the hallmarks of WhatsApp is that it's a very heavily encrypted product. There's a whole fun history behind WhatsApp because it was actually ultimately the product of Israeli counterintelligence that originally developed the product and then sold it for private use. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, Brandon's got a good interjection here too. Let's see, Brandon said FaceTime and messages or Apple software at large does not offer exclusive confidentiality, right? They're always the fine print that they have rights to all the data and seeing things, which causes some New York agencies, including some state operated offices, to go in another direction, right? So there's some of those limitations because of the in general. And then he says, however, some care management agencies do allow Apple stuff. So, you know, just kind of it sounds like the best thing is to look at the chain of command and start with your own team and supervisor and agency, and ultimately make sure that what you are doing is protecting privacy. And that the interesting part of this whole situation is it looks very different than it did before. We all were working virtually. So there are some exceptions that may have been made from what you were previously used to, but definitely check. And I brought the question up because there's this, as Christina said, this use and comfortable piece for especially the youth, right? FaceTime is so much easier and less intimidating than logging into Zoom, both for adults and youth perhaps, but really want to consider the ease of accessibility, but also need to keep in mind all the other important issues of the work we do. So it's nice to have all these tools. So it'd be great if we could all have a list of what we can and can't do.
And for those who don't know, iPhone is obviously the sort of top selling smartphone in the world. So we all kind of talk easily about FaceTime and whatnot. So the Droid version would be Hangouts, is sort of their FaceTime equivalent product that comes installed on Droid phones for kids, or for some of you that might be using the Droid phones. So one of the big takeaways here that we just want to remind everyone about is there are no perfect solutions to any of this, right? There is no perfect technological solution. There is no perfect approach that any of you can sort of attend a 1-hour webinar and walk away and say, well, this is the way I'm going to do it every time because I know it's going to work, right? Every single one of the programs that you work within existed before the COVID pandemic and will exist after, right? And so the processes and the programs and really the history and the structure that have been developed for us all was not developed with this in mind, right? And so we are doing our best. Every one of us is doing our best. The tech companies are doing their best. The agencies you work for and our partners at the state are doing our best, and recognizing that we're trying to come up with best practices on the fly, but we're still figuring it out. And probably will, the post-mortem on this will happen in years, if not decades after this, right? Where we can really look back and say, here's what we learned, and here's how we improved the lives of everyone, and here's how we didn't, and here's what we could have done better, right? And so that's a big takeaway for all of you to have too, is this is going to be trial and error. You're going to find things that work until they don't work, right? And then you're going to find things that never worked, and you're going to ditch them and try something different. And so that's part of why we wanted to create this webinar series, right? Is to learn from each other. Some of you are going to have good ideas. We might have some good ideas that you will learn from. We're all going to learn from each other and try to get better, and ultimately try to serve the kids and the families that are out there and need our support. Right. So let's make the turn a little bit now and talk about, that we talked a bit about, that's the prep work, right? That's all that work we do in the early stages to try to get ourselves into a place technologically and safety wise and privacy wise where we think we're ready to really do the work, right? To do what we're actually tasked with doing on behalf of our kids and families. So let's talk a bit about now that we're doing that work, what are some of the changes or some of the strategies that we might need to put in place to do that work here in this virtual space. So I think, Barry, you're going to take these next couple, right?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So when we talk a lot about when we're facilitating trainings in this way, missing the energy in the room and being with all of you in the same room and reading your body language. We always love if folks can put their faces on camera, because anytime you see one of these, right, or one of these, it gives us a signal which direction to go in. So all those visuals are cues. They're part of our communication, right? And we know that research shows that 80% of communication is really told in our body language versus what comes out of our mouth, right? You can say one thing, but the message is perceived completely differently by the other person, depending on your body language or your tone, or things that are much easier to read when we are sitting face to face in a room together or in a space together. And so as as our team has sort of been thinking about this and how to, put ourselves on both sides, being a caregiver or a youth or family, and also in being someone who's delivering or approaching the cans with youth and family, we want to make sure that everything you do is a little bit larger and a little bit more exaggerated than what you would do in the space we are in today, even, or what you would do face to face. And so part of that is going to be as we see here, there's a few things listed, but I would love if anyone else has anything to add to this list, either chat in or pipe up in what you found that works or what we haven't listed in consideration, right? But our posture, right? So if I'm talking to a family, right, I'm not going to be sitting like this. Sometimes I do that during a training, but that's only if it goes out over 2 hours. So posture, right? Thinking about the background that you're in and how distracting visually your surroundings are where you are, for that physical attention and the visuals on the other side. We also want to make sure that if we are working with youth, our tone of voice is going to be much more animated, right? Our eyes are going to be big and our smiles are going to be bigger. Of course, this depends on whether you're working with a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old, right? So we also want to take a look at that, and we will talk a little bit in a few minutes about the differences and how to engage with different age groups. But overall, you really do want to be conscious of making everything communicate bigger. So gestures are always good, but also we do recommend using visual tools. We have even the visual, we have little cards and little like stick puppets of happy faces, or the ratings that we've used in the past that we can that we have available, or you can make your own just to hold something up, the numbers of your ratings, or just to ask questions and get feedback. How does this make you feel? And does this face show how you feel? And if it's a smiley face or a frowny face, those are some other ways to use visual cues that you can't necessarily bring into that engagement through a screen. Also, we want to remember those active listening skills and the strong reflective language. So when we're listening, it's really important to show that we're physically engaged and that we're auditorily engaged as well, by reflecting, repeating what I heard you say was, right? Those kinds of repeating statements. Make sure that you can clarify and reflect what the family or youth are telling you and telling us. Also, to make sure that we can change our pace, right? If we're working with a family, if all of this is a new venue and Zoom, right? Make sure we stop and ask questions and give wait time, not just assume and go on to the next piece, because we aren't able to read their body language as easily either. So in a room, you might be able to notice a hesitation or a lack of understanding, or maybe a desire to share more. And so you might wait in that room, in that space together, but you may not have those same cues. And so allow for those extra little pauses and wait time to be sure that the person you're working with has shared or asked questions as much as they need to in that moment before moving on together. The other thing really is, again, that showing that you're listening and that you're sharing with the other person, is looking at the camera as much as possible. And it's really very, we should all be open and transparent, right, about the awkwardness of this. I want to hear what you're saying, and I want to look to see if there are nods or questions. So I tend to look down here where your gallery faces are. And then all of a sudden I realize my eyes are a little bit off. So if I look up here, I'm looking at a little black circle. Like, it doesn't give me you, but you get to see me looking at you, right? So it's okay to kind of recognize this and say, I'm sorry if my eyes are not exactly on you. I'm going to, do the best I can, but I might kind of flip flop. I want to make sure I'm reading your body language as well. So, it's not a perfect world the way this works. And depending again on your style and the folks you're working with, all those things can vary in the level of your comfort and their comfort as well.
A few, I'll just butt in there to say too, a few kind of pro tips that can help that process along, right? One of which is getting the image of the child or the caregiver that you're working with as close to your camera as possible. Right. So for instance, we're in Zoom right now. I have gallery mode on. So I actually you can drag and drop people in Zoom if you didn't know that. So I grabbed Barry and dragged her to the middle frame so that she was directly under the camera, so that as I'm sitting and listening to her speak, I'm watching her, and she's sort of the person closest to the camera. So my eyes are as close to to sort of looking straight at her as they can appear to be, right? So it's a way of showing that I am attentive to her, right? Most of your sessions with kids and families are going to be one-on-one or maybe one-on-two or three at most. So you don't have as big an issue as we do in this room. But little tips like that, right? Like keeping them on the screen where your camera is located if you have multiple screens. I do, right? So if I move over, if I move my Zoom window over here, I'm looking at Barry again and I'm talking, but it looks a lot different, right? Because I'm now looking at my second screen. So I'm going to drag that Zoom window to be close to my camera where it looks more like I'm having that natural conversation. So there's little tips and tricks like that, right? Like little technological things that you can do to make yourself look as normal as possible. And like Barry said, you're going to exaggerate. If anybody's been trained as a stage actor, if you did like high school plays, I did high school plays, so I've got a little bit of this experience, right? One of the things they teach you is everything has to be bigger when you're up on stage, right? Because the people watching you are far away. So if you smile, you really smile, right? And you really get big and everything is a little bit bigger than it would be in a normal world, because that's what it takes for people to kind of see it on the stage. The same is true on Zoom. We have to be, I nod my head a lot more now. And I kind of wonder when I go back to having meetings in person with people, am I going to look weird because I've been doing this for a year, right? But that's what we have to do, because that's what shows people we are listening and shows people that we are engaged with them. So we have to be mindful of how we're responding and what those nonverbals look like.
Yeah, and I think on the next slide, if you want to go to, is the next point I was going to bring up. Okay, maybe it's on the following one, but before we, that's okay, it's okay. Before we go on, I just want to stop and see if anyone has a question or comment or a suggestion or something that's worked well for them, or perhaps a hiccup or barrier that you've come across. Or an example of some of that, the body language being difficult or easy. Anything to share with us?
So Allison did chat in. I have one child who refuses to get on camera, will sit off screen and answer questions, but will at random walk away. Mom tires or tries, I think, to help, but is not always effective to getting to how the child feels, right? Definitely the privacy is not what you want if mom is chasing the kid around, to help keep them on camera. My 7-year-old, by the way, does this with his online school. He likes to wander away from his screen. So I have a few thoughts, but if you have some, Barry, you should do yours. So one of my initial thoughts on that, Allison, is that that's totally okay and reasonable, right? And again, we're all kind of learning, and even though we're 7 or 8 months in now, we're still kind of learning what this whole Zoom world is like and what the sort of social rules are. But I think it's sometimes important to think back to what are the social rules that exist in sort of normal times. One of which is if I'm meeting with a child, and I'm assuming from what you wrote here that this is maybe like a younger child, like maybe less than 10, and I may or not be right about that. But if I'm working with a kid who is in that younger age range, or really even a teenager, even though I might be with them for, let's say, an hour, I'm not making eye contact with them for an entire hour. And in fact, that would be really weird, right? And some of you may have done some of those eye contact games in the past where it turns out it gets awkward after like 5 seconds, right? And so it's totally normal to have conversations with folks, but not be looking at them the whole time. Doesn't mean we want you looking at your phone the whole time, right? But like, it's normal for us to look around the room, to have something to focus on, right? If I'm working with kids, especially kids that maybe I'm trying to build relationships with, I'm often thinking about what's an activity that we can do that's going to draw our eyes and our hands and a little bit of our brain power into that activity, because it's going to let us feel a little bit more comfortable with each other, right? So like, I'm always traveling around with a deck of cards, or I'm always have a game available, or thinking about, can we go and throw a ball or shoot hoops or whatever's available to us, right? That's pretty normal. And that's kind of something that all of us kind of have in our bag of tricks. So we can be thoughtful about what's a bag of tricks that can exist in the online world to kind of replicate that, right? So there are some online games, not some, there are about 1 billion online games out there, right? And so there are different sort of interactive activities that we can find and use. So when we did this back in May, we had a group that talked about utilizing Roblox, which is like this kind of online block-based kind of Minecrafty type environment. It is an online, sort of an open online world, so there are safety concerns there. So we had to be thoughtful about, are the permissions there for games like that? A website that I kind of like that can be fun to do is Sporkle. If any of you have ever done Sporkle, which is sort of like almost like a memory type website where there's like a million different like name the most popular Harry Potter characters, and it'll give you like the top 20 based on like how many times they appear in the books or whatever, and you try to type them in and see how many you can get, right? So little things like that I might be able to share my screen and put it up, and I can do that with the child that I'm working with to kind of keep them engaged while I'm also having conversations with them, right? While I'm also sort of doing the work that I'm doing with them, and it might be something that keeps them near the computer for a little bit longer, right? If they're the kid that needs to get up and wander around, maybe I'm talking to mom about, do you have any wireless headphones, right? Or like earbuds. I don't have mine in the room. But you know, some families and kids have those wireless earbuds that they can pair to their computer or iPad or whatever they're using. And they can walk around a little bit and still be on the call, but not necessarily on the screen. And all that kind of stuff is okay, right? Because the key here is that we are here to work with them and work within the environment in which they're existing. And so if that environment includes a kid who's really mobile and active and needs to be moving around, that's totally okay. Allison did follow up the child as a teen, so I apologize for disrespecting that teen by reading into them as being younger, but we've had discussions as to why there's a lot of mistrust and social anxiety. I just don't have the rapport to break down those barriers yet, right? And COVID doesn't really let me get past the online world. So that's a really great point, right? Of the kind of barriers that we are existing within. So let's brainstorm that a little bit. How are some of you doing that type of work when you're working with, and I think teens are a great example of this, you know, kids who might be really wary of establishing a trusting relationship with us in best of times are now, you know, we're sort of expecting or trying to get them to do that in this sort of fully online world where they've maybe never even met us in person. So what are some of the strategies that some of you might employ for that? What are some ways that we might break down some of those barriers given the limitations that we have? Feel free to chat those in or speak up. I have some thoughts, but I've been talking a lot. Barry probably has some thoughts. If you've got some, you go ahead, Barry.
You know, I want to point out too, before I offer something that Christina mentioned, a lot of times these calls are not pre-planned, right? You have to make a call on the spot or for more information, or even just to schedule your next call. And she's just mentioning it's always a good idea to ask if it's an okay time to talk. Just because someone answers the phone doesn't necessarily mean that they can take care of any amount of business, even a quick call for scheduling. And so that's a really great, respectful way to develop that, because sometimes if we just assume and we call and we just start in on our agenda, the other party may be apt to just not answer their phone next time if it's not convenient. So that helps to keep those lines open to say, hey, whenever I call, just let me know if it's not a good time to talk. You know, I'm not going to assume, but if you pick up, that's great. Or, you know, so that's a really important piece also for us to keep in mind. And even if we have it scheduled, it's always a good idea to check again. Hey, I know we scheduled for this time. Is this still an okay time to talk? Because as we all know, things come up, right? So anybody else have thoughts? So you'll notice I do not have access to any array of virtual backgrounds, but I wanted to just share another really simple way to maybe perhaps draw engagement in. And I think this could work for even for adults actually. But if you have a sense of building that rapport with a youth, or you get some information about things they're interested in, or maybe you don't yet, and this is a good way to find that out. In the Zoom setting, you can change your virtual background. There's a few just, you know, that are there, but you can also use with downloading some other, exotic places or things, but also photographs that you have can be used as a background. And so for a child who may be really into Harry Potter or Minecraft, as Josh mentioned, is there a way that you can give that youth choice? Hey, what kind of background you want me to be in today? And it could be a kind of a way to get things started, even if you're not on camera. If you can keep an eye on me so that I can make sure you're hearing and that you can answer, anything, Mickey Mouse, whatever it might be. It's a really little thing, but it makes it a lot more interesting to look at me if you're an adult or a youth, if you like what's in the background, right? And so it's just a really small, easy way for us to also give some of that choice, and also engagement, make things different and exciting and less boring. As the slide we're on now, you guys all have a chance to read, I know, that fatigue, right? Very important to keep track of. So maybe halfway through, hey, okay, let's, we're landing from the moon, and now we're gonna go and pretend we're little bugs crawling in the grass. So for the rest of the time together, let's talk like we're bugs, and we're gonna, I mean, really, it's silly, but it makes life more fun. So just that suggestion. Christina, thank you so much for these great ideas and input. Christina says in the chat box, talked with my staff about how to make connections as we deal primarily with mental health population, which can ebb and flow with trust and rapport, absolutely, based on symptomology, right? It's not always the same. We've identified calling to check in about something not treatment related, and that can help build a connection. Great idea, right? It doesn't always have to be business as usual, right? Another piece that's come up, check in on something fun and personal that you connected on, perhaps. Also suggest we can just check in for 5 to 10 minutes so they know it's time limited, won't go on forever. Great ideas. Found these things can help make connections when there are some challenges, and this happens, right, either virtual, COVID, or in the old world that we work in. And thanks, she loves the background idea. I love your ideas. Those are great suggestions, right?
Yeah, and it really ties into this slide too, right?
Yep.
This idea that Zoom fatigue is real, right? We're still kind of learning about it. Another thing that I think there's going to be about, 8,000 academic papers written on it in the next few years, because it's real and we've all experienced it. When you've had these virtual staff meetings, you come out of them after an hour much more exhausted than if you had just sat in a conference room, with your boss and your colleagues for an hour. It feels different. It is different. And we want to be respectful of that. And so when possible, instead of scheduling an hour session with a kid or a family, scheduling a 25 or a 30-minute session, or even a 15-minute, right? And doing multiples of them, right? Maybe even in the same day. Hey, I want to check in with you in the morning, and then I've got a little time around 3. Can I call you back? And we'll just chat from like 3 to 3:15, right? So like finding ways to kind of alleviate or at least minimize that fatigue can help to, just as Christina was saying, it can show that we care, which is an important way to help build relationships and rapport with kids and families, but also just works better within sort of like the structures that we're being asked to operate within, right? Just a quick little 15-minute call. And if any of you have had those, I have one colleague on my team who is like the master of short meetings. I don't know how she does it. She'll schedule an hour meeting and we're done in 20 minutes. And it wasn't that we didn't have anything to talk about. Like we just got through everything because she is just a master of that. And it feels so good to finish after 20 minutes and then move on with your day, right? And so we can recreate those little scenarios with kids and families, kind of like Christina's talking about. And that can be a real effective way to, to kind of further those conversations in those short snippets.
Yeah, I just want to also give attention to the fact that when it comes to visuals or making that connection, that consider also providing a visual in advance, right? Whether it's even, just a photograph of yourself to take away a little bit of that unknown that you might share over, a communication prior to, but also thinking about, let's say, perhaps if a family would like to have a copy of what the cans looks like, or would like to have any other visuals, whether they be, paperwork that's necessary or any kind of other thing that might help build a connection. think about mailing something ahead of time, or maybe even dropping it off in a safe way as well. So, we do have to stay physically distant, but there are lots of creative ways to provide some of that ahead of time. Again, even for youth, you have something and you've given it to them as well, so you both have something you can share and show one another. So use that as an idea as well, if necessary, but also just as an opportunity. Um, let's see, where are we here? So strategy for, okay, so yeah, so we are going, we mentioned this before, right, is to just make sure we provide the wait time. These are just some other reminders. You guys can all have access to these bullets to come back to as when we're done today, but summarizing feedback, the visual supports ahead of time that I just mentioned, and then taking breaks and really trying to give everyone the space that we need physically and mentally and just in relationships.
We want to be respectful of your time. It's 12:58. And if we have about 3 or 4 more slides to go, so we'll probably run a little bit over if you need to go. Thank you for being here with us. And we totally understand that if you need to move on. In the chat box, I'm putting in a website that you can copy and utilize. This is our resources page on our own Institute website. We have a lot of resources there, including, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of a longer version of this talk that we did back in May. And it's embedded right there on the page. You can click on it and view the video at your own leisure. But a lot of what we talked about today is on there, as well as some additional stuff that we obviously don't have time to get to here. So we just wanted to put that there. But given that, we'll kind of push forward and finish with what we have and answer any questions that you guys have. So as we look at this now, we want to kind of bring this around a little bit to, again, thinking about collaborative assessment, right? Thinking about how do I sort of do this? What can at times feel like a beast of a Cannes, New York? And how do I really complete this tool and kind of carry on with my work, given these limitations that we have, right? So the first thing we have to think about is, what is our approach going to be? And recognize that we are going to take different approaches with different types of individuals. So the way in which I'm going to engage in a conversation with a caregiver, right, an adult caregiver, is going to be different than with that teen that was mentioned earlier, or with a young child that we've maybe shared a few examples here of as ways to engage with a young child. And so we want to think about that approach from a lot of different angles, right? We've talked a bit about the space in which kind of both sides of the conversation are existing, but we're going to continue to think about that with regards to the different types of people that we serve, right? So as I meet with a caregiver, maybe that caregiver has a job that has become a work from home job like ours are now, and they might have a similar setup to this, right, where they have kind of a desk with a computer. And so our session might be a little bit more kind of professional and formal feeling. And it might be this, right? Me at a desk, talking to you sitting at a desk, both in front of our laptops, kind of doing our thing. But that's certainly not every caregiver that we serve, right? And so we want to be recognizing that many of the folks that we serve might be communicating with us in different ways, right? They might choose to do it with a phone in their hand. They might be sitting in a home with multiple kids because the kids are home all the time and they don't have the ability to find that privacy. And so we're going to think about ways in which we can change our approach to try to, whenever possible, give them the privacy that they deserve, right? So maybe that means using the chat feature a bit more than the talk out loud feature, right? Which is not always an ideal way to build engagement, but might be an effective way to let them have a little bit more privacy with us and share a few more things, even when they can't find that physical privacy in their home. It also might mean adjusting the times of day or times of the week in which we meet with kids and families, because we also know a lot of the caregivers that we support are working at job sites right now, right? Our essential workers or our folks that cannot be working from home and are obviously supporting their family. And so we're finding ways to work within that structure the same way we would outside of COVID times, right? Maybe that means meeting with them in the evenings or early in the morning before they head to work. Maybe it means a weekend session, or maybe it means a lot of those short sessions, right? A 10 or 15 minute call while they're on transport or in their car heading to work in the morning, or after work heading home at the end end of the day, right? We're finding different ways to really meet them where they're at. The same is going to be true for our teens and for our young kids, right? We've talked about a few of those examples, right? If I have a 6-year-old client that I'm serving and I want to try to have a conversation with them, I'm recognizing that full privacy may not be possible because a 6-year-old needs to be supervised by, right? The caregiver doesn't have to be in the room the entire time, but they're probably within a room or two in the house, keeping an eye to make sure that their 6-year-old is doing okay, right? So we may not have full privacy. And I may also want to think about a 6-year-old is not going to probably sit at a desk and talk to a screen for very long. They're getting better at it because it's what their schools are forcing them to do, but they're still not very good at it. They're not built for that, right? So maybe it's, why don't you get out some of your favorite toys and why don't you sit on the floor? And maybe to kind of represent that, I'm going to do the same thing, right? I'm going to grab a few toys that I've got here around the house and I'm going to sit on the floor and put my laptop down and we're going to do this together and talk a bit about that and use that to build our relationship as we then have some conversations, right? And the same goes for our teens, probably not sitting on the floor playing with toys, right? But finding ways to help them sort of exist in a comfortable setting for themselves and replicating that as best we can to show them that we are respectful of their space from our side, right? And then the ways in which we develop that engagement are going to be different for each of those types of kids. One of which is we need to show transparency, right? We need to build transparency and use it throughout our work. So that means always explaining to kids and families why we are doing what we are doing. Right. So if I'm looking to gather information that's relevant to the CANS New York, I'm explaining to them what the CANS is. I don't need to give them the full breakdown of how the entire tool works, because as you all know, that's basically a full day of training and even more training online to really understand the tool. But I am kind of coming up with that elevator speech to explain real briefly what this tool is and why it's important, right? I use this tool to organize your story. We use these numbers because they help tell me and all the other helping professionals that are going to support you, what the needs are we're going to work on and what the strengths that you have are that we want to try to build and work with. And I have to be honest with you, it's a requirement. My program requires me to use this tool and it helps to make a bunch of decisions on the back end, but you don't have to worry too much about, but are really important to us because it helps to keep us all paid and doing our job and trying to help you. So I'm going to kind of use this tool. And if you want to know more about it, I'm going to tell you. If you'd rather just have a conversation with me and I'll kind of guide you through it that way, we can do it that way, right? But it's building that transparency and really helping the kids and families and everyone understand what it is that we're doing. This is really even more critical now because if I'm sitting in your living room and maybe I brought a little notebook with me to take notes, it's very obvious what I'm doing. But when I'm on Zoom, I can be sitting right here writing and you probably don't even notice that I'm doing that, right? And so that can feel a little weird if I'm the person who's being written about. Right? If I do sort of pick up on, wait a minute, Barry, what are you doing? Can I tip? No, this doesn't work that way, but I'll bet you're writing something about me. So what are you writing about me, right? We have to be transparent. We have to be honest. If we're taking notes, we want to be honest about taking notes and why we're doing it and remind folks that they are fully entitled to our notes, right? To look at everything that we're writing about them. And then we want to be communicating not just by asking questions about sensitive topics, but doing that pre-communication that we are going to ask about sensitive topics. We could do a whole training and a whole day talking about how we do this, but we want to normalize these conversations and remind folks that even in this weird world that we're all living in, we're still going to ask these questions, right? So, teenager that I'm working with, I want you to know, I'm going to ask you some questions about things like suicide and things like sexual assault and things that feel kind of grody, right? I'm going to talk about physical assault and I'm going to talk about if you feel bullied at school. And I'm going to ask you because it's important and because I ask every kid that I work with, because we know this happens to some of the kids that are out there in the world. And we know that there are ways to help people that have experienced these traumas. And so I'm going to ask you about those and I want you to be ready for that. And I'm probably going to do that next time we meet. Right? So I'm priming that pump. I'm helping a person and normalizing those questions and helping them understand that we are going to have some of those conversations. And I'm going to acknowledge, right, as I'm going to do throughout the entire process. And it's okay to be honest. This is transparency too. This is weird, right? Doing a Zoom meeting and talking about this stuff, which is already kind of sometimes feels weird to talk about, is super weird to do it on Zoom. It's weird for me. It's probably going to be weird for you. But I'm still going to do it because it's important. And it's one of the ways that we show that we care and that we want to help you. Right. And so we're going to be honest and transparent. And we're really going to show folks that just because we're existing in this sort of strange 2020 world, it doesn't mean we're not going to continue to try to help them. Right. And then the same thing that we're going to be doing when we're sitting in living rooms and we're working with kids and families has to happen in this online world as well, which is handling disagreements, handling conflicting perspectives. The purpose of the CANS is not to have everybody agree. It's in fact quite the opposite. The CANS is meant to be a tool of disagreement, right? It's meant to bring in all these different perspectives, right? A child may not see that they have a particular need or a particular problem that others believe that they have and want to work on. So the caregivers may have a different perspective than a child, right? The providers and some of the other helping professionals in the world who know the kid and family may have their own perspectives that might line up with some of the caregivers or kids and not with them in other situations, right? So this is meant to be a tool to hammer out and work through disagreements and conflicts. It doesn't mean it has to be a tool of everybody agreeing, but it is a tool that allows us to discuss those disagreements, right? And to find ways to work towards solutions, even when we don't all agree on the problems, right? So if we have, a school provider who's telling us this kid is constantly getting in fights, they have an anger management problem, we need to do something about that, right? But then when we sit with the kids in the family, we hear sort of a different version of that story. Yeah, we know there's been some fights at school, but we don't think it's an anger problem. We think it's, this is the only Black child in a school full of white kids and they're being mistreated because of that. Or this is a child who is a member of the LGBTQ community and we think they're being bullied and they're responding due to that bullying. Or we think this is related to their mental health. And yeah, it might be showing up as anger, but we think there's something a lot deeper going on there than just a kid with an anger problem, right? And so we're finding ways to bridge those gaps. So one side might be saying this is all about anger management and behavior, and another side might be saying there's a lot of other stuff that we actually think are needs here, right? And so our job as care manager and the tools job in this process is to help bridge all of that and help us kind of arrive at what are some of the ratings that can reflect this whole story, right? And so we have to do that through this online world, and that can be really tough and that can be challenging, but that is our task, right? And so we want to be honest about that from the front. We're gonna sometimes disagree. I'm gonna sometimes see it differently than you do, and when somebody else that I talk to sees it differently than you do, I'm gonna tell you about that. I'm gonna be honest with you and say, I did talk to your therapist, right? And they had a different take on this, and I want to be honest about what they've said, right, to me, because if they've said it to me, they should be saying it to you as well. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and then we can sort of come up with a plan to address what the needs are, right? So I just said a mouthful. What are your thoughts on all of that, or do you have responses?
I just want to recognize that there was some really great animated body language coming from Allison. And it seems like when you were speaking about the disagreements or conflicting perspectives among caregiver and youth, et cetera. So I just wanted to see if there give an opportunity and some space if Allison, you wanted to share anything or if you were just in agreement and that kind of was something you were acknowledging with us.
Gonna get off. I'm just gonna talk because chat is gonna be too much.
Absolutely.
So I have 3 cases that are all related, and dad needs a lot of education in reference to symptoms and diagnoses. So when I talk to him about what's happening, I get very much.
Well, it's possible she logged out and will join us back. Does anybody else have anything you want to add or any comments? And hopefully she can jump back in with us. So that's really the end of the content that we had. We have a lot more, as I keep referring to. It is in that video of the longer session that we did a few months ago. But really, this is an ongoing conversation, right? As we all kind of develop and continue to understand our relationships to all of this work. So I did just want to, kind of bring us back to reminding you folks about, Barry and I are both members of this CANS New York Technical Institute. CANSNYinstitute.org is our website. I had put our resources page, which is a part of that website, in the chat earlier, and we wanted to call your attention to that. You are always welcome to reach out to us, and that includes supporting you with kind of the stuff around passing the CANS assessment, which is a real thing, and you have to do it every year. We know that's annoying. So we're here to support you with that. But more importantly, we're here to support you with stuff like this, right? With ideas and with thoughts and with conversation around some of the challenges you might be facing, or even as you're thinking about a particular item or a few items on the tool and you're not really sure how to address them or how to rate them based on a unique situation that you're running into with a kid and a family. We get those calls all the time, and we love to process those with you, right? We're never going to tell you should rate rate a kid this way. That's not our job, but we can give you some ideas and some avenues of thought that you might not have considered yet, and really try to help you and your team arrive at what you think might be the right answer and approach to that. And so we like to make sure you're available. We do have the state broken up into regions here. That's not to say you can't reach out to any of us, because we all do work together. Barry's email is right there on the page, but she's going to add it to the chat box as well. And I'm adding my email into the chat box too, so that you've got that information for you. This is just a reminder that we do have that recording of the previous webinar that we had done. And again, I had put a link in the box earlier that should help with that. Looks like Allison is back. If you want to finish your thoughts, Allison. Hope everything's okay there.
Yeah, no, my internet just decided to not work in the other room anymore.
Good timing.
So what I was saying is that Dad has a lack of education and understanding of what's happening. So when I ask him about needs and about, sort of what's happening, I get a very superficial, oh, they're fighting, or, oh, they're not doing this, or it's very about activity. Well, when I speak to the kids, either they want to totally not talk about issues, or they're like, no, that's not the problem at all. The reason why that's happening is this. You can never have conversations with the two of them in the same room. I always have to have a conversation with the caregivers on the phone, and then ask the kids to step out, and then I do video chats with them, because without it, I have no clue what's going on. So that's just sort of how I deal with differences, rather than trying to have them come together and discuss it together, because that's just not going to be functional, because they're living together in a very small space. And I don't want to be the source of more conflict. So I tend to discuss with one, then have them separate, and then discuss with the other. And I sort of tend to use my judgment as to which side or what mix of both sides I'm going to use for the kids, because sometimes it's very different.
Yeah, it's a really great point that you're bringing up, right? Which is this idea that not all parties in our conversations and sort of on our teams that work with kids really understand the world in the same way, or all use the same language, right? And so, parents come into their understanding of their kids with such a deeper and more attached relationship to the kids than we will ever have, and to their needs than we will ever have, right? My boss, John Lyons, who's the guy that made up the cans, right? He describes it this way. I'm going to draw on my screen here, so let me know if this doesn't work. He talks about caregivers and family members as really having this deep knowledge, right? This like they understand and have this understanding of everything that's kind of happened start to finish with the kids and families. But what they don't always have is like the broad knowledge that some professionals bring to the table, right? So we as professionals tend to have all this kind of technical knowledge. So like, here's my college education, and here's all the experience I've had working with like hundreds of different kids, and here's all that additional continuing information that I've done, and like, here's what my supervisor and all my colleagues are able to bring to the table, right? So like, we get all this additional information and all these sort of knowledges of diagnoses and blah, 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 right? That give us sort of some language to put to, and some experiences that other kids and families have had to kind of say like, oh, this looks a lot like this other kid I worked with, or that the person in the cubicle next to me had a kid like this, and they used to talk about him all the time, right? So I think I have an idea here, but I don't understand all the depth of what's going on for that family, right? But the parent does, but they might not have all this sort of like technical knowledge, right? And so our job is to kind of bridge all of this together, right? And to find a way to, what you're describing to me reminds me of X, Y, or Z. And I want to share with you a little bit of like what I've learned, and here's how we might describe it in the field of psychology or social work, right? And here's some of the strategies that other families have tried for this. So it becomes less about putting an exact label on, or expecting a caregiver to really understand every little nuance of maybe a diagnosis that their kid has. And it becomes more about, what are we going to do about this, right? And that's the piece that often we can agree on, or at least work towards agreement on, right? So if the kid and the caregiver and us don't all agree on sort of what to call the problem, we might get closer to an agreement on how to sort of address the problem, right? And then you can backward engineer sort of what your assessment looks like from there, right? So like, this is what we did for another kid that had a similar issue, and I think this might be a good strategy to try. And here's how I would represent that, because the cans, like this tool that I use, the cans is all about like action levels, right? So like, if we're going to try to work on this, then that's how I would represent it on the assessment. I would give a 2 or a 3 to some of these items, because that's sort of what this type of intervention reflects, relates to, right? And so we can use the tool in that way. We don't have to have the parent or the child or anybody sort of be in full agreement on the way in which we're going to describe every problem exactly to the language of the tool, but they might all agree on what we can do about it. And so we work with them there, right? That solution focus approach. How are we going to find a strategy that we think might work? And can we all agree there? And then we'll work backwards from that. All right, well, we want to thank you so much. We have our emails that we've put in the chat box, and we definitely encourage you to view some of the other supplemental materials we have on our site. This is going to be an ongoing Lunch and Learn series.